Welcome to HurricaneCenterLive.com. I'm Alex Garcia, Director of the National Tropical Weather Conference and Executive Producer of these programs. These programs are made possible by USAA, the South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, and Plylock's Hurricane Clips. These programs are also a team effort with Bill Reed, the former Director of the National Hurricane Center, and Tim Smith, Chief Meteorologist of KRGV-TV. And now, here's Tim Smith.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Live, part of the National Tropical Weather Conference and the Storm Science Network. Glad to have you all along this morning. I think we have a terrific program today. Got to get your eyes open after being up all night watching those election returns, and we don't know anything more than we knew 12 hours ago, but we'll know something soon, we hope. But we're glad to have everybody along today. I want to thank our sponsors who make this program a possibility every time we do this. That's USAA. I'm getting some feedback from somebody. We'll take care of that. There we go. Thank you. We've got our sponsors, USAA. We appreciate everything you guys do. Day in and day out, you've been a sponsor of the programs from the Storm Science Network for a long time. Plylock's Hurricane Clips. These little guys right here, big part of our program as well. We had Plylocks on a couple of weeks ago to talk about how simple these things are to use. If you don't know about them, by all means, check out their website. And the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, that's the home of the National Tropical Weather Conference. We're there every year, except for 2020. We were supposed to be there, but obviously we were socially distanced away. South Padre Island is open as long as you maintain your social distance there. Go and have a nice autumn vacation. All right, great program today, but let's get to the current situation first. And for that, let's turn it over to the former director of the National Hurricane Center, Mr. Bill Reed. Good morning, Bill.
Morning, Tim. I remember when we talked about doing these talks about a month ago, heading on into November, and I feared that we would still be active. And unfortunately, much to my surprise, my extended forecast seems to have been correct. I'm going to show a few things very quickly because we have a very interesting long program today. We want to make sure we get it all. Okay, here's the satellite IR animation from this morning, and you can kind of make out the center of the circulation there, and perhaps fortunately all the deep convection is migrated away from the center, so maybe we've stopped the heavy rains that occurred all day yesterday on the northeast corner of Nicaragua and parts of Honduras, but there's still quite a bit of convection, and the fact that it's slow moving, the heavy rain threat is still very much in existence. A large area of deep moisture, great outflow and all that. So the early indication from the satellite to me is that some remnant of the system will maintain some structure as it eventually comes back out over the Caribbean. Close-up animation on the visible points out the center rather clearly here over what is now north-central Nicaragua, getting ready to move into the mountainous regions of Honduras. Here are the latest forecast from the National Hurricane Center, and it's very consistent in the forecast. All along, they've been talking about a remnant of the system reemerging over the Caribbean, and then potential for development as it moved northeastward or northward. A lot of uncertainty on the details, especially since we're not quite sure what all the structure will be when it comes back out over the Caribbean. But surprising a little bit to me is all the models are now pointing to the very similar forecast of the storm eventually in 5 days, reemerging into the extreme eastern Gulf, the Florida Straits, or the Florida Peninsula. We're not quite sure what all we'll have for a structure on it there. The discussion talks about it merging with an extratropical upper level low, and here's an image of it on Friday as it comes across the northern Gulf Coast states at 500 millibars, and that's going to create the steering current that brings it northeastward. And then as we get into the end time of the forecast, as you can see, whatever comes out of the Caribbean merges with this upper feature. So I think their discussion of a hybrid-like system is the best approach for now, but there sure is a lot of uncertainty as to how all this will evolve. That being said, there is an impact to the U.S. now being forecast. This is extremely heavy rainfall being forecast in the 7 to 10 inch maybe even 10 to 15-inch range over the 7-day period across southern Florida as the system slowly approaches, and the best dynamics for rain are in that area. Okay, back here. Stop presenting. I have to talk for myself while I'm doing this. I'm very sorry about that, guys. Okay. Again, we have an all historical event here. Storms have produced history-changing impacts in the Atlantic Basin, and we have 4 experts on the historical aspects of hurricanes today. I'll introduce each one as they speak, and we'll start off with Dr. Eric Dolan, author of Furious Skies. We had him on here a few weeks ago. We're fascinated with what he had. So, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you start the discussion in some of the way back when hurricanes.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Yeah, I'm going to start in the 1500s, and as many of you no doubt know, that's about the time that the Spanish Empire was colonizing Central and South America, and they also wanted to reach out to the northern continent. So in 1559, 11 ships left from Veracruz, Mexico, heading to the Florida coast. They actually landed in Pensacola Bay, what is Pensacola Bay now, Pensacola Harbor, and they were trying to establish a new colony. Things didn't go well for the first few days. The Indians were rather hostile, but they started to offload the ships. There were 1,000 people, including, in addition, 500 soldiers. So they were really making a good try at colonization. But then a hurricane hit that area. And of the 9 ships that remained, 6 of them were sent to the bottom of the bay. The 3 others were damaged. Most of their food and supplies was gone. The food they had offloaded already onto the coast was drenched with rain. Now, the Luna expedition, as it was called, tried to survive as best as it could for the next few months and into a year, but they're really having a difficult time. The Indians weren't very cooperative. They weren't, the relief ships that were sent to resupply them didn't sort of make the grade. And eventually the Luna colony entirely disappeared. And just imagine what might have happened had that colony not disappeared, and had they gotten a foothold in the Pensacola area, the Spanish might have started to migrate outwards towards the north, west, and east, and North American history might have changed significantly. Now, just about 5 or 6 years later, in the mid-1560s, there was another hurricane that had a great impact on the future of colonial history. And this is a time in about 1564, 1565, when Spain and France were battling one another for control of Florida. And both of them sent over quite powerful fleets to take control of their area of Florida, St. Augustine area for the Spanish, and further north in Jacksonville for the French. And the French fleet was very formidable. So was the Spanish fleet. And the French decided in 1565 to go down and vanquish Menendez and all of his Spanish soldiers. And they were off the coast of St. Augustine when another hurricane came by. And that hurricane sent the entire French fleet, 500 soldiers and Marines, south, and they crashed into the shallows of Cape Canaveral, off Cape Canaveral. Menendez and his troops, they knew by the direction of the wind that either the French fleet had, definitely the French fleet had been pushed to the south and very likely had crashed. So this gave Menendez an idea. He decided to go north to the Fort Caroline that the French had established and take that out. And he did. And it was a 40 or 50 mile slog over the land during a hurricane. And then he quickly retraced his steps, because he thought that if the French fleet had crashed, the remnants of that fleet might have made it to land and might have walked north and would attack St. Augustine. So Menendez went down south and he picked up the survivors of the 500 Frenchmen that had been on those ships which crashed in the shallows of Cape Canaveral. A little more than half of them had managed to make it to shore, but Menendez caught all of them and tied their hands behind their back. And in a sign of how much hatred the Spanish had for the French, he summarily beheaded and otherwise killed 200 of the French soldiers, leaving only 100 as prisoners. And basically that event was the end of the French efforts to colonize Florida. So again, had the French succeeded, had that hurricane not struck at that moment, it is quite likely that the French might have overpowered the Spanish. And then instead of Florida becoming a Spanish colonial possession up until the 7 Years' War in 1763, it might have become a French colony. And then it's very conceivable that the history of North America would have changed dramatically, because not only would the French have come from the north in Canada to the south, but they might have gone north from Florida. And the other hurricanes I want to talk about are the ones that took place in 1780. So during the American Revolution. In the summer of 1780, French and British fleets were in the Caribbean protecting their colonial possessions and also refitting and preparing for the war that they were engaged in. Of course, the French had recently become allies of the American colonists, and the American colonists were fighting the British. But during the summer of 1780, two massive hurricanes struck in the Caribbean and killed more than 22,000 people, sunk numerous British and French ships. And this caused the French, who had been wavering about going north to help their colonial allies, it caused them to change the calculus of their decision-making. They decided that they didn't want to remain in the Caribbean during this subsequent hurricane season. So when 1781, the summer of 1781 rolled around, the French fleet sailed north, not only to escape hurricane season, or the brunt of hurricane season, but also to aid their American allies. And of course, we know what happened there. They got there just in the nick of time to protect the American and French forces who were in Yorktown, squaring off against the British forces and Lord Cornwallis. So the French fleet plugged the opening to the bay, and they had the Battle of the Capes, or the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, and fought off the British fleet that had come down from New York. They headed back to New York. And then, of course, George Washington and his French allies beat Cornwallis and the British, and that ended in the surrender, the Battle of Yorktown, surrender on October 19th, 1781, which was a defining point in the American Revolution. Although it didn't end it, it did serve as a turning point, and not long thereafter, peace negotiations took place. So once again, it's amazing as an historian to think about how history might have changed had that hurricane not struck and the French not decided to go north to help their American allies at that moment. So those are the hurricanes I was going to cover. I'm happy to pass it off to the next person. You're on mute.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Eric, our next speaker, Dr. Kerry Mock, is a new attendee to our NTWC Live. He comes to us from the University of South Carolina, where he is a professor in the geography department. And I've followed him for a number of years on the interesting investigative work he does on historical aspects of storms, a lot of them in the official period of record in our hurricane record in the 1850s. So Kerry, take it away.
Okay, I'm glad to be here. So what I thought I would do first is just very briefly kind of mention, I kind of come through this perspective a bit more as a geographer. That's what I am. So I look at stuff, there's regional impacts, there's maybe huge national impacts. Like Eric mentioned, the whole country could have changed from some hurricanes. And then I tend to be a little bit more biased on looking at primary data, which is what I do since I have to do research and all that. So in trying to think about hurricanes that change history, I kind of struggle. I guess it's a loose term in a way. You can easily think of the modern period where you have the Katrinas and the Andrews and all that. And that changed the way we think about hurricanes. But a lot of those in the pre-1900 era, a lot of them people don't really know much about. So it's hard for me to actually assess how they change history. But I'll just throw in some things there. There's some of the obvious ones that changed them at the local scale, when they just cause pure damage and kill a lot of people. So you can talk about something like the 1831 Great Barbados hurricane that killed thousands and set the economy and things like that in that area several decades back. And then there's, I tend to be a little biased somewhat towards the South Carolina stuff a little bit, but the 1893 Sea Islands hurricane, and there was a major hurricane in South Carolina later that year. Not only did it kill thousands, that's the immediate impact, but it changed the whole rice culture industry of the South. South Carolina, up to the Civil War, was actually second in the nation in producing rice, and it was the main place to produce rice. And after the hurricanes, after that, the rice plantations and all that were pretty much never really existed practically again. So, but one of them I'll talk about more, here is the 1752 South Carolina hurricane. When you get a little bit later past the 1500s, we have a little bit more settled nations, and all that. So it's hard to have a real huge nationwide impact, but that one's a little bit more involved. Now it's like a Hurricane Hugo type storm, Hugo from 1989. But from my research and all that, from ship logs and things like that, I think it was stronger than Hugo. It was smaller than Hugo, but it had about the same storm surge. So given all those equal, the winds, from my impression, had to be stronger, maybe even approaching Category 5. But with the older data, I can't quite prove that. But what it did there is the hurricane recovery was the big key thing after that, where there was a big conflict between a royal governor and then the South Carolina Commons House, and they're slow to get stuff to recover. The royal people didn't want to really give them the resources to recover. We even see that to some extent today with big hurricanes and recovery. So that increased the huge tension in the American South perspective, even before the New England stuff, leading up to the American Revolution, where the agricultural stuff in the South was set back. Charleston was a center. So that's one of the, not the only catalyst, obviously, but one of the important, but maybe unknown catalysts that led up to the American Revolution. Another thing I do with hurricanes, I'm trying to make sure I don't go over on time here, is I've done some stuff with hurricane memory, looking at primary documents and newspapers and stuff like that to see which hurricanes are kind of legacy hurricanes over long periods of time. I imagine, some of those like Andrew and Katrina, people are going to know about those hundreds of years from now. But when you go farther back, there's not nearly as many of them. I think 1752 was one of them at the regional scale for South Carolina. The people didn't forget about that hurricane, even back to 752. In New England, I'll just mention it, that 1815 really stands out. The 1815 hurricane was a pure tropical type of hurricane, as opposed to nothing against the 1938 Express. But that one looked very tropical and all that, and people always noted about that. And probably a lot more research should be focused on that one. And New Orleans, the 1812 hurricane stands out. That's one of my favorite storms. But what it did for history, which may not be as much known, is it prevented the British from invading New Orleans early in the war, which back then probably the Americans would have been caught off guard. Of course, the British tried it a few years later and didn't do very well. I think some hurricanes can have a background factor. You don't necessarily pinpoint one hurricane. Like, for example, the 1837 hurricanes and 1839, they affected Bermuda and stuff like that. It really influenced the thinking of hurricanes of William Reed, The Law of Storms, which was the big debate about hurricanes like global warming is today at that time. The South Carolina, Georgetown area, in the 1820s and 1830s, and a 20-year period had 11 hurricanes, and they actually transformed the cultural landscape, which defined the rice agriculture, which was very dominant at the time And the last thing I'll say here, which is one of my wild ideas, although I had to look more into it, when you get to the 1850s leading up to the Civil War, that's when the South really became prominent in their antebellum agriculture. And there weren't that many landfalling hurricanes. You know, I'm not going to necessarily say that the lack of hurricanes caused the Civil War, but it's maybe attractive to think that way. Okay.
Okay, Terry. Very good.
Okay, guys.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay. We're going to jump forward in time here, and we're going to go down to Chris Lanzi with a very tropical-looking setup for his presence with us today at his house in lovely southern Miami-Dade County. So, Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for the opportunity for participating today in this session. Just make sure, can you all hear me okay? All right, great. So I was grappling with what storm would be best to talk about. Camille was one that came up 1969 that struck as Mississippi and Louisiana as a Category 5. But for me personally, affecting me as well as profound effects on the country, Hurricane Andrew in 1992 was one that I just, I thought we needed to spend some time on. So just a little perspective, 1992, I was a graduate student studying hurricanes in Colorado, yet I grew up in Miami. And the hurricane destroyed my parents' house. Fortunately, they were not hurt. So I came down afterwards the next couple of weeks and helped them clean up and find their possessions. So Andrew occurred when I was trying to formulate my understanding of hurricanes, still am. And so it's everything, especially if you lived in Miami in 1992, is either pre-Andrew or after Andrew. That date marked everyone's time frame for their life. So a little background about the storm. It was August 1992. It was a fairly quiet start to the hurricane season. There was just one subtropical storm earlier in the year. And Andrew came out of the deep tropics, but by around August 19th or 20th, it started sputtering and weakening as a tropical storm. And they were about to stop writing advisories on it. It had become so disorganized. But the National Hurricane Center decided, well, let's hold on to it for one or two more advisories. Because there's a chance it could redevelop, and it did. A big ridge throughout the troposphere developed north of the system. Not only did that steer Andrew back to the west over the Bahamas and Florida, but it allowed for a very low shear environment, and it quickly ramped up from a tropical storm all the way to a major hurricane. As it reached Miami on the early morning of August 24th, this was the last image from the old WSR 57 radar that was installed in Miami. They were about to decommission it and put in the new Doppler radar, but they hadn't got there yet. And so you can see that donut of orange and red shows the eye wall. And whenever you see that, that's indicative of a major hurricane, very symmetric convection. And of course, the strongest winds are within that donut area, the eye wall itself. So the hurricane made landfall in South Miami-Dade County, did not make landfall over downtown. And you might say, well, what's the difference of 20 miles? And for a system like Andrew was small. And so it was a huge difference, and it could have been much, much worse if the eye went over Miami Beach and downtown Miami. Those two areas only experienced Category 1 conditions. So it occurred late night, and when morning arose, disaster was apparent throughout all of southern Miami-Dade County. Some of the statistics, peak winds, we now estimate were 165 mile per hour sustained winds with a central pressure of 922 millibars. In 1992 dollars, it was $26 billion of damage from agricultural losses, from homeowners, from business owners. That was by far the largest price tag for a single hurricane at one point. Direct deaths, 26, most in Miami-Dade County, a few in Louisiana as well after it made a second landfall. And one thing that was just astounding to me was that it completely destroyed over 25,000 homes and damaged another 100,000. That is phenomenal amount of destruction. And in this case, very little was storm surge. It was almost all wind-caused damage. So when you look at a hurricane like Andrew today, what kind of impact might it have? So $26 billion in 1992 was a huge amount. But since then, you can see in the census reports, Miami-Dade County keeps having more and more people living here because 99% of the time, it's a great place to live. In addition, per capita wealth keeps going up in general. And so when you take into account inflation, per capita wealth, and population increases, that $26 billion would roughly be $100 billion today. So doing that apples to apples comparison of hurricanes in the past from 1900 onward until today, this would put Andrew as number 4, right behind the 1926 Great Miami Hurricane, the 1900 Galveston Hurricane, and 2005 Hurricane Katrina that Phil is going to chat about next. So what are some of the ways that it changed the nation and how we deal with hurricanes? There were some incredible changes made to the insurance industry, as well as building codes along the coast in Florida and elsewhere. So on the insurance industry side of things, one aspect that was revolutionarized because of Andrew was catastrophe models. So these are models used by insurance companies to figure out how much they may have to pay out for different types of hurricanes and how often. So those models were in their infancy back in 1992. And afterwards, there are several that are used worldwide to help determine not just hurricane impacts and payouts that insurance companies may have to do, but also for example, earthquakes as well. There were huge changes in the way insurance policies were written. Back in 1992, it was very common to have very low deductibles and full replacement. Now, policies are much, much, much more expensive, and deductibles are much higher. And so, so that was a big change that the insurance industry put in place afterwards. In part because of that, it became more regulated as well. And a lot of the private insurance companies got out of issuing insurance. And so there still exists today the Citizens Property Insurance Corporation in Florida, which is, it's not the largest insurer in Florida, it's one of the top ones that are there. Building codes, one of the really nice silver lining after Andrew was that Miami-Dade County and Florida in general realized they needed to boost their building codes, because there's a lot you can do, like the clips that Tim mentioned at the beginning of the program, to mitigate the damages. You can reduce the damages quite a bit by keeping the wind getting inside your house. And so the Institute for Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, they do rankings of how good are the hurricane building codes across the United States. And their most recent one from 2018 still had Florida as the best state for building codes in place. And this is directly because of Andrew and repercussions from that. One other interesting aspect to Andrew was it was considered Category 4 at landfall when it hit. But since then, we learned a lot more about the structure of hurricane winds with height. And because of that, 10 years after Andrew in 2000, a group of us reanalyzed, that is, we revisited the database for Hurricane Andrew. Green shows the original time series for intensity, that is maximum winds, and this would be the landfall here in Florida. This would be a landfall in Bahamas. And red shows the revised. So because of a better understanding of how winds change from flight level down to the ocean surface, we're able to boost the winds a lot. We went from 140 mile per hour hurricane to 165 mile per hour hurricane. So because of that, we did revision to history and called it a Category 5 10 years after the fact. And it was, I could go into some of the detail, but suffice to say, such a decision is tough because you never have all the information you want because there's not anemometers of wind measuring devices everywhere. Most of the time, whatever are out there get destroyed by the hurricane because they either lose power or get disabled. So we had to use a variety of inferences to come up with that Category 5 label for it. So one last thing is the meteorology is incredibly advanced compared to what it was in 1992. So just give you a couple snapshots of the actual forecast models and the National Hurricane Center's forecast back in 1992 for Hurricane Andrew. So actually we'll skip forward to the next slide. So this was a 3-day forecast, about 2.5 days before it hit South Florida. The system was still a tropical storm at the time. And the models they had by today's standards were very primitive. They were statistical models. They were a simple one-layer advection following model. And they were just starting to introduce the global forecast system model, which is in orange. And so at this point, this forecast is a 3-day forecast, had a huge error. I mean, that's about a 400-mile error. And today our average errors are about 100 miles. And so you can see what happened was the official forecast was for it to be east of the Bahamas. And in actuality, on the 24th at 2 p.m., it had actually hit Florida and crossed into the Gulf of Mexico. So it was a lot farther south than predicted. The actual prediction is in light blue. And it was also a lot faster than predicted. So fortunately, our computer models are a lot better today. And the global forecast system, which was just being experimented with that year, did a really good job with Andrew. I think I'll skip the next. And just to finish up, one thing that I got to do after Andrew was to do a lot of photography afterwards. You have to remember back in 1992, there was no cell phones, there was no GPS. And because Andrew completely obliterated all street signs and all the vegetation, you couldn't tell where you were. So when families like this family, the Acosta family in South Miami-Dade, were trying to get their insurance adjuster to come out and take a look at their house, they literally spray painted on their missing garage door their address, their phone number, and in this case, they put a little bit of a message: Andrew, you big bad wolf. And it's got the mama pig, the daddy pig, and the little baby pig. So it was interesting to see the messages, both angry and sad and hopeful, that people had spray painted on their homes to help identify where they were living for the insurance companies. So that to me is an opportunity to share with everyone a little bit about Andrew and some of the impacts it had on the meteorology, the building codes, the insurance industry, and out in South Dade, Miami, Florida. Today, there's no residual impact that you can visually see in Miami-Dade County. Everything's been rebuilt, and I think we're much more better prepared for the next time we get Hurricane Andrew. Thank you very much.
Great. Nice reminiscing about Hurricane Andrew. Hadn't thought about that one in a long while. Well, our next and final speaker of the panel is our seasonal expert, Dr. Phil Klotzbach, and he's going to tell us about the next 10 storms we'll have this year. No, I'm wrong. Phil's going to talk to us about Katrina. Have at it, Phil.
All right. Can everyone hear me and see me? Yeah, so we're going to talk with you about Hurricane Katrina, and I think everyone would certainly agree that Hurricane Katrina was definitely one of these hurricanes that changed history. To give you a little bit of background, I was also, like Chris Lancey, I was also studying hurricanes at Colorado State under Dr. Bill Gray in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina came through. It was one of the years we forecast to be extremely active. We forecast 20 named storms in 2005, thinking that was about as many as you could get. And of course, we had 28, which we've just tied so far in 2020. But fortunately, so far in 2020, we have not seen quite the impacts that we saw in 2005. And obviously, I think with 2005, the biggest storm everyone remembers, and I think was the one that still sends chills up and down people's spines is Hurricane Katrina. Here's an infrared satellite image of Hurricane Katrina on August 29th, or late on August 28th local time, as it bore down on the central Gulf Coast. At this point, it was a Category 5 hurricane. So here's an infrared satellite loop of Hurricane Katrina as it approached the coast of Louisiana and then went up into Louisiana-Mississippi border for its second landfall. You can see very powerful storm, very large storm, had a large eye. But as the storm approached, it did weaken. Katrina weakened from a Category 5 down to a Category 4 operationally. In the best track after the season, it was downgraded to a Category 3. But as you can see, the storm, in terms of its overall size, the storm stayed together, or the storm size didn't change much. It actually got a little bit larger as it approached the coast, and its pressure remained very low. And I'm going to come back and talk a little more about why the pressure of Hurricane Katrina was so important, because when you talk about hurricanes and you talk about their pressure, lower pressure means a stronger overall storm. If you have weaker winds and a low pressure, that means you have a very, very large storm. And obviously, unlike Hurricane Andrew that Chris talked about, where wind was the primary culprit, with Hurricane Katrina, it was obviously flooding, enormous storm surge in Mississippi and in Louisiana and Alabama, into Florida, and then also obviously the levee failures, which caused a tremendous number of fatalities. Here's the observed track of Hurricane Katrina. Kind of like Andrew, Katrina formed, it formed east of the Bahamas, a little closer to the coast. It did ramp up quite quickly, made first landfall as a Category 1 hurricane just north of Miami, tracked southwestward across the Everglades, really didn't weaken very much, then got into the Gulf of Mexico, into a very, very favorable for the hurricane environment, very low shear environment, very warm waters, an upper level anticyclone that helped kind of improve the exhaust of the storm, helped the storm ramp up. And the water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, as you would expect in late August, very, very warm. Here's the observed sea surface temperatures for about the time Hurricane Katrina was in the Gulf. As you know, the Gulf of Mexico is a bathtub every year. Sea surface temperatures between about 84 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, plenty warm to support really, really nasty hurricanes. And given the low shear and high moisture environment, Katrina did rapidly intensify. As Chris talked about with Andrew, the forecasts in 92 were fairly primitive. By 2005, we did have much better modeling. A lot of these high resolution models had already come in, plus we had much better global forecast models. And if you look, here's the track forecast for Hurricane Katrina from Friday. You can see the forecast track was remarkably good. Basically forecasting a first landfall over Burris, Louisiana, which is exactly what it did, and then a second landfall near the Louisiana-Mississippi border. The intensity forecasts were a bit lower than what actually was observed, but certainly in terms of the track, leaps and bounds better than what we saw with Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Obviously, we had much better modeling technology in 2005 than we did in 1992. And even since 2005, the forecast models have gotten a lot better, especially the track forecasts have gotten much, much better. The intensity forecasts still pose problematic, but those are improving as well. So from a meteorological statistical perspective, its lifetime maximum intensity, it was a Category 5 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, had a very, very low pressure, 902 hectopascals. Its first landfall in Florida was as a Category 1. Obviously, it did some damage there, but I'm going to focus obviously on the next two landfalls, which were the extremely impactful ones. Its first Gulf landfall was as a Category 3 hurricane with a pressure of 920 millibars or hectopascals. Second landfall near the Louisiana-Mississippi border, 928 hectopascals. And it was also the lowest pressure on record for a hurricane making landfall in Louisiana. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Hurricane Laura, which made landfall earlier this year. Hurricane Laura had winds of 130 knots or 150 miles an hour, which tied it with the last island hurricane of 1856 for the strongest hurricane on record to hit Louisiana by wind. But its pressure was 938 millibars. Katrina's pressure was quite a bit lower, and overall the surge was higher with Katrina. The area that was impacted was also much larger with Hurricane Katrina. Obviously, we also have to realize where Laura made landfall was fairly sparsely populated. Obviously, where Katrina made landfall impacted a much larger area. And just to kind of show you how kind of anomalous Katrina was for its winds versus its pressure, here's a plot showing the wind-pressure relationships for all U.S. landfalling hurricanes since 1950. And if you look, you see in general, lower pressure is associated with stronger storms, but there is some spread. And you can see the red dot is Hurricane Katrina. And Katrina's pressure was 920 millibars or hectopascals. Its pressure was equivalent to the 3 Category 5, or equivalent to both Hurricane Michael, which was made landfall at 140 knots, and then Hurricane Andrew, its pressure was 922 hectopascals, so slightly higher pressure, even though the winds obviously in Andrew were much stronger. And that's, as Chris mentioned, Andrew was a very small storm. Katrina was a very large storm. So we actually published a paper basically arguing that in the future we should consider categorizing hurricanes by pressure as opposed to wind. As Chris also mentioned, it's really, really hard to measure winds. First of all, measuring them even by aircraft can be challenging because you're trying to measure the strongest winds in a swath. But measuring the pressure, if you have a well-defined hurricane, is pretty straightforward. If you look at Hurricane Katrina, its pressure was equivalent, we argue, to a Category 5, whereas its winds were a Category 3. And as you would expect with this very, very large, powerful storm, it had a phenomenal storm surge associated with it. 28 feet of storm surge in portions of Mississippi, tremendous storm surge in Louisiana as well, also Alabama up into Mobile Bay, and even some storm surge in Florida, which is just remarkable considering the storm made landfall, its second landfall near the Louisiana-Mississippi border. It was providing strong storm surge even all the way into Florida. And obviously, as you would expect, the storm surge damage was just tremendous. You can see just block after block just wiped out by the storm surge from Hurricane Katrina. And then really also too, obviously, what caused the most fatalities was the levee failures in the New Orleans metropolitan area. As you can see here, you can just see all the houses. Unlike in Mississippi, where pretty much everything was just pretty much wiped out, in Louisiana, a lot of these houses were still there, but it was just they were obviously inundated with water, so just a phenomenal amount of damage. And obviously everyone remembers just the humanitarian disaster that occurred in the weeks after Katrina. Here's images of people on roofs waiting to be rescued after the flooding inundated the city. So just a humanitarian disaster following Hurricane Katrina. Fatalities, direct and indirect fatalities in Louisiana, almost 1,600. 238 in Mississippi. So as I always tell people, even they had the levees held and New Orleans mostly been spared, the storm still caused over 200 fatalities, primarily due to storm surge. And that's one of the things I think that really the Hurricane Center has really focused a lot more on storm surge watches and warnings and really emphasizing the storm surge challenges. And that's the loss of life from storm surge is pretty much almost gone down to 0 since that time. 14 direct fatality and indirect in Florida, and 2 even in Georgia and Alabama. Total damage from Katrina was about over $100 billion, and now with adjusted for inflation and wealth, it's up to about $175 billion. So just a phenomenally damaging storm, and certainly one I think that we could certainly agree had changed history. And lastly, I did want to plug some new research that we actually just got published. It's in press for the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. If you're interested in historical hurricanes and a historical hurricane season, myself and some colleagues have published a paper on the 1933 Atlantic hurricane season, which was a phenomenally active season. It generated actually more accumulated cyclone energy, or ACE, than did the 2005 season. And here's a daily weather map from September 4th, 1933. In September 4th, 1933, we had just had a landfalling Category 3 major hurricane make landfall along the Treasure Coast of Florida. And you see also a rather impressive-looking low-pressure area. That was the Cuba-Brownsville hurricane, which, as you would expect from the name, made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane just 23 hours later in Texas. So talk about a crazy hurricane season, and they certainly had some severe impacts. So if you're interested in more historical hurricane stuff, I invite you to check out that paper. So with that, I'll end, and I guess now's the time for questions.
Awesome. Great job, gentlemen. I'll probably have a million questions, but I'll keep my mouth shut after a few observations so we can get the audience comments on that. So to me, I see a common theme in looking at these historical storms is that in the end, what the catastrophes they've caused that have made them historical were caused by bad decisions by people. In the early part, in the historical pre 1900s, say, we really did, the bad decisions weren't anyone's real fault. They just didn't know what the risks were from the hurricanes. And then you start looking at the ones that Chris and Phil talked about. We know better. We know that you can't build the houses that blow away at 100 miles an hour in South Florida, but we do it anyway. We know that storm surge is really bad along the Gulf Coast, but as I speak, there are new houses being built within sight of water here in Galveston County, flat on the ground. So the challenge is catching that lightning in a bottle kind of thing, like in Andrew, and actually coming back and making a building code that works. Precious few other states have done what South Florida did post Andrew. I can attest to that over in Texas. It's a constant struggle just to hold our own with a minimum code that will not stand up to an Andrew-like storm. From your guys' perspective, what do you think the next lessons learned ought to be going forward from our history of storms? Carrie, I'll start with you. What the heck?
Okay, well, I have a little bit more of a longer bias, of course, but I like to see that merge a little bit more closely with the more current modern stuff. So, when you have those building codes or return intervals or what the insurance does, it'll be more of a holistic approach of looking at things.
Okay. Chris.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was how deadly Katrina was. And that was from a hurricane that everybody knew was coming and was a Category 5 24 hours before it made landfall. And it shows the importance of having the decision makers at the national and the state and the city level, making sure they understand the hurricane hazards and making the right decisions, even though those can be very unpopular to call for evacuations. But if they don't do that, then people are going to die. An example of that happened in St. Bernard's Parish, where the mandatory hurricane evacuation came one day after the hurricane. And that was the area where there was the nursing home, where it went underwater, and so many of their elderly patients died because the decision makers made the wrong choice and did not order a mandatory evacuation. And so we have to be vigilant on that and educating the decision makers, emergency managers, governors, other elected officials, that they need to make sure that they get the people the heck out. Otherwise, we'll have another Katrina. And that's what scares me, and that's what concerns us at the National Hurricane Center, so that we redouble our education, because even though, as Phil mentioned, the fatalities from storm surge have been low, that's not a guarantee to keep happening in the future. We have massive education that has to be done every year because so many new people move into states in harm's way.
Eric, your thoughts? You're muted.
Yeah, I'm going to bring it down a little bit because I'm relying on human nature to make a change for the better. And sometimes I don't have as much faith in human nature when it comes to making wise decisions. You had mentioned development along the coast. I live in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and we've done studies here, or local scientists have done studies showing what's going to happen with sea level rise and future nor'easters and potential hurricanes. And still, people are building very close to the shore, low-lying areas that are very prone to flooding. So I would hope that in the future we can become better at making regional, local planning decisions and enforcing them, so we don't create a situation where we're sort of increasing the load for disaster when a hurricane does come along. Another thing that's a problem with human nature is people are very unwilling to do things that have a large upfront cost without a definitive back-end liability. And I wish that people were more forgiving of meteorologists and local politicians who tell them to evacuate, and then perhaps the storm tracks to a different area. And in hindsight, you didn't need to evacuate. So as I said, I'm not holding my breath. I think that demographics are showing that more and more people are moving to the coast. A lot of people with a huge amount of disposable income are building enormous houses right on the shore. The good thing for them is they have enough money where they can probably afford flood insurance and they can repair if necessary. But it's not just those people who are near the coastline. So I am quite concerned. And I can tell you, being from New England, where we don't think about hurricanes as often as you do down in the South or in the Gulf Coast, it's just a matter of time before another hurricane of 1938 is going to end up in our neighborhood. And when you see what a nor'easter does to downtown Boston right now, if you could imagine what a hurricane category 3 or maybe even worse hurricane might do if it plowed into Boston today, a lot of pain and suffering. And so, you know, I think it's going to be a periodic more of the same. We do get incrementally better, but we're not always the best at planning for our own best future. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, well said. Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I think these other fine gentlemen have done a great job kind of highlighting a lot of these points as well. I mean, I think to Eric's point, we do have large growth in population and wealth along the coastline. And, you know, I mean, I think this year really serves as a case in point of, you know, we've had 6 hurricanes hit the U.S., and yet the damage from these hurricanes has been about 30 billion, which is a lot. But you look at these, look at Andrew, look at Katrina. I mean, we've gotten kind of remarkably, obviously people have been really hit, but we've gotten remarkably lucky in terms of we haven't had a major hurricane, one of these nasty hurricanes hit a major population center. Had Laura gone 100 miles farther west into Houston, I'm sure, Bill, you could attest to kind of the damage that it would have done there had Laura taken some of the model forecast tracks just a day prior. So, you know, I mean, the growth in population, you know, I mean, we do have these kinds of things where you could see, you know, as we talked, I guess we didn't really talk too much about the Great Miami Hurricane, but, you know, if that storm were to make landfall today, a high-end Cat 4 ran to downtown Miami, you'd be talking $200-300 billion in damage. So, you know, there's definitely that potential is still there. But I mean, I think with kind of just the last point on Chris's point, like if you had told me in 2005 that a very well forecast hurricane would kill, you know, almost 2,000 people in the United States, I would not have believed that was possible. And, you know, even the forecast that was a really good forecast. So, I mean, I guess it's like, you know, I think we learned some lessons from Katrina, but again, you know, it's getting people, you know, making the right decisions at the right time. And I think Neil Frank used to say it was, you have to evacuate 3 times for every time you need to evacuate. You evacuate 3 times for every time you need to evacuate, or something along those lines. And probably with improvements in forecasting, maybe it's 2 times, but, you know, not every time. I guess the thing is like, well, you know, if you come back and your house is still there, you should be thankful your house is still there, as opposed to the alternative where, you know, yes, you need to evacuate, your house is gone. Like, at least, you know, instead of, probably should be actually thankful that your house is still standing, as opposed to the alternative. So, but there's been a lot of studies conducted on evacuations and things along those lines. So I think there's, you know, a lot of kind of work being done on that. I think really getting more social science into meteorology is critical to kind of help improve these forecasts going forward.
Yeah, that the challenge with the evacuation with this big population centers and the growth there is it keeps pushing the clearance times farther and farther out. And human nature being what it is, on a nice sunny day and a storm still in the Caribbean, people on the Gulf Coast are going to maybe want to hedge their bets and wait till later to evacuate. I think that's a challenge going ahead. Tim, I don't want to forget our audience. What you got for questions there?
We've got a couple of them coming in. Thanks, Bill. Marcel's asking Dr. Mock, he says, do you think the lack of hurricanes in the 1850s created a desire to explore more in the South, to go more to the South? He says, was it due to a divine blessing, or were they aware of the variability in hurricanes?
Okay, well, back then there was the law of storms controversy was still going on, so the people in the South generally didn't differentiate hurricanes from actually winter nor'easters. So I think they kind of, there's always the belief even back then that when people settle and they plow and they do all sorts of agricultural stuff, they could change the climate and all that, but they never really mentioned hurricanes specifically.
Good, thank you. And Barry made a comment, Barry Goldsmith made a comment that don't forget the level of trust, talking about Katrina in particular, the level of trust people put in some of the most vulnerable communities. He says some only trusted the message from their church. And in some cases, they may have trusted their faith in God to guide their decisions. Others wouldn't leave due to a real prospect of looting. They were afraid to be looted. And then others just were optimistic, just thought, it's not going to happen here. And that's a discussion about Katrina. Go ahead.
Can I add something there real quick that just you saying that brought it up? It has to do with the current assault. I think assault is a fair word on science in our country and expertise. And I just feel that it seems to be their decreasing interest in taking the words of experts, or at least weighing the words of experts, and in this case, meteorologists, is causing a problem. I think it relates to, I used to work for the government. I worked for NOAA for a while. I worked for EPA. And I think also the distrust of the government. I'm not saying it's misplaced. There are a lot of reasons to distrust government and bureaucracies. But there's something, when it gets eroded to such an extent, when people don't believe what they're told, when there's a good basis for what they're being told, it really makes it very difficult from a policy perspective and a social perspective to make good decisions. And I think that's a very serious problem right now. I don't know how to solve it, but it seems to me, since I've been around for a couple of decades at least and very involved in policy debates, that it definitely has gotten worse in recent years. I'm not just talking the last 4 years, I'm talking about the last 10 or 20 years. And I think that's a real problem, and it's a real loss, because I do believe that most experts, most of the people who work for the National Weather Service and the meteorologists are skilled and well-meaning, and they're not trying to dupe people. And I just wish there was more confidence in the people that we as a country put in a place to warn us about things. I just wish there was more confidence in that process. So anyway.
That's a great point. If anybody else wants to comment on it, I think that's a subject for a good discussion. If anybody else has a thought on that. But while you think about that, we've also got a question for Chris. What do you think of the next steps to change about the hurricane community? Is it the Saffir-Simpson scale, a preparedness aspect, insurance, communication? Marcel's asking specifically about the non-English speaking community in South Florida, and how do we more effectively reach those people? But then that question's for Chris about what's next.
Right. So we're continuing to push forward in the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center with new products and services, and a lot of that nowadays is communications. So how do we harness social media to reach out to folks effectively? And so one example of that is the emphasis in the Weather Service for MAS. So it's a Spanish language translating service that forecasters provide, so that when there's, for example, a media inquiry in Spanish for a weather forecast office and they don't have any Spanish speakers, you can reach out to a cadre of colleagues to help with that request. And so we want to continue to make sure that we can communicate with everybody, because we realize, not just in the United States, but our colleagues in Central America and South America and the Caribbean, they speak Spanish, they speak French, and we want to make sure that they understand our forecasts as well. We do have responsibility at the National Hurricane Center, not just for the United States, but we provide the big picture 5-day forecast for every country in the Western Hemisphere for hurricanes. And so we want to make sure that we're not leaving anybody out, and that can be a challenge. Because people interpret things very differently. So yeah, to me, the biggest challenge the next decade for hurricanes is, how do we best communicate the impacts and have people take the right actions?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's been my observation for about 25 years now, is that what we have to say is pretty well known now, but how we get it to people is difficult.
Okay, Bill, do you have any more thoughts? We're up and it's 11 o'clock. We're promised our panelists we'd have them out of here in an hour. So, Bill, if you have any last thoughts you want to wrap up with, and then we'll close it from here.
Yeah, I really like that. Someone, I forgot now who mentioned it, but there are storms everywhere along our coast that hang on in memory beyond the generation that was impacted. So those of you that are broadcast meteorologists or practicing operational meteorologists, it behooves you to know what those storms are in the markets you're working at so that you can relive that aspect for the lessons learned. Here in Galveston County and Houston, the 1900 storm that changed history down here is probably the legacy storm. If there's going to be another one that I've witnessed, it would be Hurricane Harvey from the horrific flooding that we had, but it's too soon to say on that. We're still in most of the generation that experienced it's still here.
Gentlemen, any final thoughts? Anybody have something you want to say just in closing that, historically speaking, where we've come, where we've been, lesson learned, anything you want to close with? We'll start, we started with Eric, so we'll go back to Eric again. Any last thoughts?
No, I think we covered pretty much everything. I just want to thank all the meteorologists and people who give us the forecast. I've gained a new and deeper appreciation for the weather report that I used to look at more superficially. Let's put it that way.
Okay, Kerry.
Well, as Bill said, some of those recent things like the Harveys will eventually be a legacy storm, but given what's going on with climate change and all that, and what it does and what it does not do to hurricanes, of course, too, we're entering interesting times.
We are indeed. Dr. Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really good to try to keep these historical hurricanes alive and to relive and to basically kind of remind. I think it's important, especially because you will go through periods where your market may not be hit by a hurricane for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You can go through really good strings of luck and then have bad luck. But I think it's important to it's important to keep these historical hurricanes alive such that when you do get a new hurricane, you can compare them with them and give people some idea, because a lot of times if they haven't had one recently, they think this is something that's never happened before. And it's important to kind of tie in these historical hurricanes and to talk about it. I mean, I think really it is, I mean, it's amazing some of those 1800s hurricanes in Texas, how they changed, where development ended up taking place and stuff. I think emphasizing, these historical hurricanes and just how much damage they did. And if those storms came along today, what kind of impacts they would have. I think it's just important to kind of keep these historical hurricanes alive. I normally tweet a lot about historical hurricanes during the season when there's breaks, but this year we didn't really have any breaks. So not as many historical tweets as normal, but hopefully next year we'll have more historical hurricane tweets and fewer tweets about the actual hurricane season.
We're all good with that. Thumbs up on that. Thanks, Phil. And Chris, any other thoughts? You just gave us some good final a minute ago, but if you have anything else.
Yeah, just related to what Bill said, it's important to put records into context. A couple years ago when Hurricane Michael made landfall as a Category 5 in Northwest Florida, it was a big to-do. First time ever we've had a Category 5. Except Camille hit 150 miles farther west. So, as a Category 5 back in 1969. So, you always have to put an understanding of what do these records mean and how does the technology affect our ability to determine what's actually happened. We're trying to grapple with that ourselves here at the Hurricane Center as we're getting to Hurricane Ada and certainly the one or two more we're going to have after that, and what this new record really means. So that's an important perspective. If you're talking about records, what is the actual reliable time period for the record taking place, and does technology affect those records in any meaningful way?
Well, gentlemen, thank you. What a fascinating panel discussion this has been today. What a wealth of knowledge and information you gentlemen have and have shared with us, and we really appreciate that. Eric's book, if you don't know, is A Furious Sky. Pick it up. It's a great read. I noticed one of our people viewing today said he just finished it, so the timing was good. He got to hear a little bit more about that. So a great book. Dr. Klaasbach, Eric, Chris, I keep calling doctor. Everybody's doctor here. So doctors, everybody, we appreciate it. Everything that you've done today. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it so much. And Bill, of course, thanks for your insight as well. Thanks to our sponsors, USAA. We appreciate everything you guys do. You're a big part of everything we do at the Storm Science Network. Plylocks hurricane clips, they look just like this, but they can save your house. Check those out. And the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, we hope to be back on South Padre Island in April of 2021. If all goes well, we'll be back there socially distancing as we must. And that wraps it up for today. Alex, what's coming up next?
Oh, boy, we've got some interesting things coming up next for next week. We're still working on a program here. Maybe we'll talk with Phil about his couple of papers that he's put into the BAMS unit there. I liked a couple of those, Phil, particularly your latest one there about the 1933 storm. Maybe next week we can talk about that a little bit more in detail. We've got Josh Morgan coming back in, and, of course, everybody knows Josh. He's got reports from what's going on down there in, of course, the hurricane house that he has set up, supposedly there in Mobile or in Alabama or somewhere. But thanks so much for being with us here this afternoon now. So, again, we will be with you next week, same time, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time now for the next National Tropical Weather Service live. Here in the close. And we are clear.